I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to the 66th meeting of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting this evening to continue its study on foreign election interference. The clerk and I will maintain a consolidated speaking list of members wishing to speak.
On Thursday, we will begin at 10 a.m. with a steering committee meeting, followed by Minister Mendocino on foreign election interference, and then for the third hour, for some of us, the second for others, we will proceed with the first panel of our colleagues concerning the Federal Electoral Boundaries Commission report for Ontario. Thursday, April 27th, Tuesday, May 2nd, and Thursday, May 4th, we will be meeting in room 225 West Block, just upstairs, so that our colleagues on another committee can have access to this room. This evening, we have with us Jean-Nicolas Bordelot, doctoral researcher, Steve Waterhouse, retired captain, former Information System Security Officer, Department of National Defense and Cybersecurity Specialist, Laurence Gaudin-Robillard, PhD candidate, Groupe de recherche sur la surveillance et l'information au quotidien. You will now have up to 4 minutes for an opening statement, after which we will proceed to comments. Monsieur Bordelot, bienvenue.
Welcome.
Chair, I would like to begin by thanking the members of this committee for inviting me to testify today. I hope that I can be helpful and provide insightful responses to your questions. As was said, my name is Jean-Nicolas Bordelot. I am a PhD student with the Konrad Adenauer Research Chair in Empirical Democracy Studies at the University of Ottawa. I previously completed a master's degree in political science at the Université de Montréal and a bachelor's degree in political science and psychology at the Royal Military College of Canada. I have conducted research with the Centre for International and Defence Policy at Queen's University, the Electoral Integrity Project at the Royal Military College of Canada, the Canada Research Chair in Electoral Democracy at the Université de Montréal, and more recently with the Centre for the Study of Democratic Citizenship at McGill University. I would like to highlight that I am a political scientist who studies human behavior, so my expertise is centered around the behaviors and attitudes of citizens in the face of threats to democracy and democratic institutions. Specifically, my research considers the impact of information, whether it's misinformation, disinformation, or factual information, on citizens' perceptions of electoral integrity, their attitudes towards democracy, as well as their likelihood to participate in the democratic process. In my time conducting research at the Centre for International Defence Policy at Queen's University, I had the opportunity to conduct in-depth research on the Government of Canada's response to foreign interference, specifically with regards to federal elections. My research involved a comparative assessment of the election security policies of the Five Eyes countries, including Canada. Therefore, I can confidently say that I have a thorough understanding of the policies and efforts that already exist to mitigate interference, such as the Elections Modernization Act, the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, as well as the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol. Based on the scope of my expertise, I can respond to any questions you may have regarding the impact of information and specific election security policies on Canadians. I am able to discuss the effects of foreign electoral interference on voters, as well as the role of misinformation regarding election interference on Canadians' confidence in democratic institutions and elections. More precisely, I am able to engage in important discussions on a range of topics, including the potential effects of election interference on voter behavior, the threshold for making information regarding foreign interference efforts public, and the lessons that we can draw from the election security policies of our Five Eyes partners. With that being said, I am not in a position to comment on the nature of specific incidents of foreign interference that have been reported by recent media reports. I can, however, draw inference from broader research on foreign electoral interference and apply these findings to the Canadian case. Sur ce,
I'd also like to mention that I'll respond to questions of members in both French and English according to the language that the question was posed in. And moreover, I provided a copy of my opening remarks for this testimony to the clerk. So thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Thank you to you. Mr. Bordelot. And now,
Madame Goudem.
Ms. Robillard. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, for welcoming me on behalf of the UQAM in Montreal. I am a lecturer on digital issues at UQAM, and my research has faced on the circulation of information via TikTok. The interpreter would request that the witness slow down her opening remarks.
Via les médias sociaux numériques.
Une minute. Oui.
So the interpretive staff have just indicated to us that they're unable to keep up with the pace. So for those of us that don't speak French, we would need that translation.
Donc, on va commencer.
We'll start again, please. And if you need a little bit of extra time, I'll give you that time. But if you could just speak a little more slowly, because we do have both official languages. Sorry, it's a bad habit of mine. I apologize. So let's recommence. Ms. Robillard. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for having me here on behalf of the Groupe de Recherche sur l'Information et la Surveillance au Quotidien of the University of Quebec in Montreal. I'm a lecturer in digital media and a doctoral student in communication at UQAM. My doctoral research focuses on the circulation of information via TikTok. My master's thesis focused on Instagram and Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential election. My remarks here will focus on the processes of foreign interference via social digital media with Canadians, which hinders informed decision-making at the heart of civic duty in an electoral context. The results of these operations, by way of these media, can hardly be circumscribed because several actors are responsible. There are three elements that must be considered. First of all, the first element to take into account is the very functioning of socio-digital media and their economic model, allowing the free production, dissemination and circulation of content and information. The challenge for social digital media is not that the content is true, but that it circulates as much as possible. This operation is integrated in a commercial circuit of data, of big data, where the user leaves a trace or a footprint, a like, a comment, a click, which is collected and processed, which allows the profiling of the user, and thus one can send him or her a personalized offer of content, which itself will produce a new footprint, and so on and so forth. This leads to a monitoring device that is exploited, among other things, for commercial purposes such as online targeted advertising. Then there is our second consideration, which is algorithmic personalized content. Recommendation algorithms are a trap, according to the scientific literature. They now shape and dictate the entire interface of our social media. Users end up with a personalized offer of content that captures their attention. Thus, by algorithmic calculation, if it has been determined that you will enjoy a type of content, you will be exposed to it, regardless of its quality or veracity. Our third consideration is the user themselves. Not only are they confronted with a veritable overabundance of information, some call it infodemia, but since all content is quote-unquote equal, it becomes difficult for them to distinguish truth from falsehoods. This difficulty is currently exacerbated by personalities with voices and platforms that question certain institutional pillars of democracy, such as journalism. Moreover, users may enjoy consuming content that confirms their opinions, even if it means being caught in what is called an echo chamber. Moreover, without intending to harm or relay misinformation, they may inadvertently or unknowingly reshare fake news. This is called misinformation. They are thus, in spite of themselves, participating in interference. In closing, there is no doubt from our point of view that the integrity of the electoral process has been and will continue to be threatened by current social digital media devices. But it is crucial to emphasise that there is not just individual or state entities that are responsible. It's a question of a vast connection with these or network with these actors and socio-technical elements that stand in the way of the citizens' duty to be well informed. In that sense, it's imperative to examine the situation from a global, social and communicational standpoint. Current and future elected officials must continue to increase their knowledge of social and digital media in order to better regulate and legislate them. Moreover, they must not produce misinformation or disinformation themselves that undermines trust in our political and media institutions. Finally, this discussion could and should save the way for improving public understanding of information issues. This is especially glaring when the leader of Twitter changes the process of information flow at the expense of the quality and credibility of users and the content that they produce. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Thank you. I just gave you, Mr. Bordelot's extra time. Mr. Waterhouse, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm a lecturer at the University of Sherbrooke's Master's Degree Program in Information Security Prevention Component, and I'm a former Information Security Officer at the Department of National Defence, also a former Assistant Deputy Minister for Government Information Security and Cyber Security of Quebec.
To share insights on some of the problematics viewed, anticipated, and perceived by fellow citizens on unwanted interference by foreign actors towards our democratic process. La solution.
The situation. The committee has had the opportunity to hear from various stakeholders in recent weeks about how the subject of this study is important to the evolution of our society. You'll have understood that in these modern times, the use of tools, particularly computer tools, is indispensable in carrying out these influence operations. In the 20th century, it was through radio, newspapers, television, cinema, or even religious representatives who were very present in society, allowing a form of validation of the message before its dissemination, thus applying a form of coercive control. With the development of technologies and means of communication, as never before seen in history, we have the ways to reach everyone across the planet in a few milliseconds without filters or controls, checks and balances. We are facing fundamental and counterintuitive changes that our society can be influenced with methods, both unconventional and subtle strategies, such as the following. A. Lawfare. Seeks to legally justify, well, we've got media, public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, cognitive warfare. Mr. Waterhouse, if you could again speak a tad more slowly, please. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Should I start again? No, that's not necessary. Not this time round. So please do proceed. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. So, I was defining what cognitive warfare is. It is the use of knowledge for conflict purposes, and in its broadest sense, cognitive warfare is not limited to the military or institutional world. From the latter type of warfare tactic, the various threat actors in cyberspace have evolved greatly with the introduction of mass influence applications of all kinds, such as Facebook, TikTok, WeChat, and others. As a specialist with the ADM of the DRDC National Defence Stage in November 2021, and I quote, "Technology and the profusion of data together make human behaviour the primary vulnerability itself. In its extreme form, cognitive warfare can exacerbate internal divisions, sow discord, and leave a society vulnerable to friction, polarisation, and radicalisation."
What does that all mean? Over the last 20 years, a technological evolution progressively inserted itself in our society with the promise of making our lives easier with automation by using smart devices. The notion of having a form of connectivity in every utilities of our lives, like coffee makers, household appliances, TVs, etc., seems to be very practical and convenient. Without embedding good cyber security in its designs of these devices, the potential for those to become vectors of influence by applying some sort of control like software features enabled or disabled at will, complemented by the application on smartphones which are communicating towards the rest of the world. As one other cognitive warfare expert, François de Cluzel, stated, "Any user of modern information technologies is a potential target. It targets the whole of a nation's human capital. This battlefield is global via the internet. With no beginning and no end, this conquest knows no respite, punctuated by notifications from our smartphones anywhere, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Qu'est-ce qui peut être fait?
What can be done? Strong leadership is needed to address this. Education and awareness building of these new subtle ways of engaging by external agents is essential to prevent the erosion of our democracy. Governments of all levels must be aware of this in order to strengthen their governance and be in a position to reassure citizens. We need better cyber hygiene when it comes to technological tools. At all levels of our society, it should become second nature so that we can make the most of those technologies.
In both official languages. Merci.
Merci à vous. Donc,
Thank you. We'll start with our round of questions, 6 minutes per question. Mr. Cooper, Ms. Sirota, and then Ms. Normandin, and then Ms. Blaney.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Bordelot. In a July 2021 paper that you wrote for the Center for International and Defense Policy entitled Securing Elections, a Comparative Assessment of Canada's Response to Foreign Interference, you rightly note that the Canadian government has the full liberty to decide whether or not to disclose interference. And that is precisely what other of our allies have done, including, as you note, the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Public Register established by Australia, which I'm going to ask you about shortly. But we also saw the United Kingdom, for example, last summer. The UK government, along with the MI5, when they became aware of a Beijing agent working within the UK Parliament, a letter was written to the Speaker of the House of Commons. That individual agent, Christine Lee, was named, as well as the members of Parliament that were influenced by Ms. Lee. CSIS has advised this government that when it comes to foreign interference, that the policy of the government be grounded in sunlight and transparency. And yet we have seen absolutely no sunlight and no transparency. Indeed, all of the troubling revelations about a vast campaign of interference by Beijing in the 2019 and 2021 elections have only come to light as a result of whistleblowers and reputable journalists. Do you find it troubling that the government kept Canadians in the dark over what clearly was some very concerning issues relating to interference by Beijing? And contrast that to how some of our allies have approached this in contrast.
Thank you for the question. I would say that it shows a weakness in the current policies regarding the critical election incident public protocol and a need to perhaps improve and clarify the threshold under which information regarding active attempts of foreign interference in Canadian elections need to be made public. I think something that is important to highlight from our Five Eyes partners, notably Australia, is that they exercise something called controlled transparency, which is transparency when it comes to information that is unambiguous, that is verifiable, and that has been verified by intelligence agencies, and in the case of Australia, the Electoral Integrity Task Force. And so the information that is made public in those countries does not concern active investigations or does not concern any potential threats to elections. They concern active threats that have been verified and that are being made public because they're unambiguous. And so I think that's something that needs to be perhaps incorporated within the Canadian policy, election security policy, and within this threshold of information, which currently is somewhat unknown and up to a select few individuals to decide upon. And so I think that there's certainly work that can be done in this policy area.
Right, and in the case of Australia, that is made public through the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme public register. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think it's a website that you can. Well, it is a website that you can actively consult, and even as a Canadian, you can go on the website and see listed events of foreign interference on there.
Well, and building upon what you said with respect to the critical election incident public protocol, in the same paper that I referenced from July of 2021, you said that there's just too much discretion to the government when it comes to reporting interference. When I posed and other members posed questions to two members of the election task force about what the threshold is, they had a real challenge explaining what the threshold is. Do you think the threshold is too vague? Is it too high? How could it be fixed?
Well, I think certainly there needs to be a clarification as to what the threshold is, and there needs to be also it needs to be made a bit stricter, in my opinion. It needs to be clear that once information reaches certain elements, which we can certainly discuss. I think the unambiguity aspect is certainly an important factor that would be on that threshold. It needs to have been a foreign interference event. And then once this threshold is met, I think it should be automatic that the information be made available on a sort of registry like Australia, on a website or through a press release of some sort.
And pursuant to the cabinet directive, it is the threshold that is described is that there are incidents or an incident that threatens Canada's ability to have a free and fair election. That seems like a very, very high threshold. Would you think it would be appropriate, for example, that the public be made known when there's interference happening in one riding? Perhaps that might not threaten Canada's ability to have a free and fair election, but it certainly is a major concern, especially if you happen to live in that riding.
Yeah. Well, I think certainly, but I think there also needs to be parameters. I think the vague mandate also comes with its downsides in that, yes, in the event that information is shared, there needs to be controls, and it needs to be controlled transparency. I think that's important. Unverified information in the hands of the general public can be extremely damageable and damaging. And I think that this is why I think Australia adopted a very neat model in saying this information needs to be verified by a series of agencies. And once everyone signs off and it meets the threshold, we can publish it online.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Sahota.
Madam Chair, through you to the witnesses, thank you. I think that was a very valuable exchange that we just had. We're really trying to figure out where the gaps are and how we can improve them through legislation. That's what we've been hearing through several meetings. However, there is some confusion as to, how do we even properly identify whether it is a foreign state actor, or it's misinformation or disinformation coming from some unknown source, and that was brought up in an earlier meeting today as well. We've had examples of, let's say in the last election, of information also shared on WeChat where it was stated that the Trudeau government would legalize all hard drugs and things like that were trying to sway Chinese voters, Chinese Canadians away from voting for a Liberal government. So there's an exchange of all of this information at election time that's going on that's not from verifiable journalistic sources that is being shared. We don't know where the sources of this information is coming from, and it's becoming more and more dangerous, I think, the environment, because we don't have a strong media ecosystem. We have a lot of media outlets that are shutting down in this country. We also have what you've mentioned, Ms. Ribillard, about Twitter. Also now no longer the users not being able to identify a verifiable source versus, bots and others perhaps state actors that may be trying to influence our elections or just the thought process of Canadians in general. So what would you say? What should we do in order to improve our media ecosystem, make sure that there is reliable information? You touched a little bit on that just now, Mr. Bordelot. How do we improve our system of receiving information? Sure, go ahead, Ms. Robillard.
S'il y a quelque chose,
Well, if something has been proven over the recent weeks with the new owner of Twitter, it's this. It's easier to put labels on content or accounts. Now, when you can legislate or implement rules as to online content, whether it be on Facebook, when you share an article and you admit or you claim that it is a verified source or it must be proven, that could be done. Artificial intelligence can categorize content, for example. That can also be honed with the owners of socio-digital media. That would be one of the solutions. I'll defer to my colleagues as to other potential solutions or suggestions.
That will be my turn. In the light of managing the information that goes to the public, it's very hard to, yes, pinpoint the origin of the sources, as obfuscation is omnipresent. Whatever information is produced from anywhere in the world, it could be from here, from inside Canada, as well from other countries across the planet. I cannot agree with Lawrence here in the fact that you can mark the data according to the source of information, as again, false information can also be justified as valid as real information. So bottom line remains the education and the awareness made to the public by various means, just like the Cyber Security Control, the Cyber Center for Security of Canada just put on various programs to educate the people, but that has to be put down to a level that is accessible to everyone. You cannot have a thesis of 5 pages with small characters that let people know what is the threat, how to address it, and how to live with it. It's not necessarily also during election time that the information has to be filtered, because before an electoral process, people get influenced with all sorts of discussions and matters, and by such, when it comes to the election period, well, they're already pre-programmed, if I can use this term, to cast their votes along the influence they got throughout the 2, 3, 4 years before that election.
Yeah, I would highlight the point of Mr. Waterhouse in saying that I think education is a key factor here. It's going to be extremely difficult to attack the attackers in this sense. And even if we do create policy and pass new bills or modernize the Elections Act in a way that prevents attackers from doing foreign interference, I think they're going to find other ways to do so. And so I think that the best way we can counter foreign interference is through citizen preparedness and through educating Canadian citizens and showing them how to consume information appropriately. And as was said, I don't think this is going to be achievable, but by 21-page CSIS reports that probably only a handful of Canadian citizens have the time to read or the desire to read. I think there's going to be there's a need to have to bring it to a level that is going to be of interest to Canadian citizens, and that there's going to be a desire to learn. I think I'd also like to mention that we talk a lot about misinformation, but I think it can also come from factual information. It's pretty easy to twist facts and to frame information, even real information, in a way that is going to hinder trust and undermine trust in the Canadian process, in the democratic process. A study that I've conducted recently uses the same source of information, which is basically factual news media reports and CSIS reports that have been published, but frames the information slightly differently. One in a more positive, we're combating foreign interference tone, and the other one in a more negative, foreign interference is actually happening. And we see drastically different levels of trust in citizens between the two treatments.
Thank you.
I wish I had more time. There's so many
We
follow-ups to
always
that.
wish for more time. Madame Normandin.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating to listen to these exchanges. I'll try and direct my questions at specific witnesses, but if anyone would like to tack onto those answers, please do so. Ms. Cornier-Robillard, just to reiterate what Mr. Waterhouse said, can you be a state foreign actor and create interference by yourself, or do these individuals already need to be vulnerable in echo chambers? I'm trying to get a sense of this. Do you need a receptive population before you engage in that kind of operation? Response. Well, yes, you can create content with a view to interfering, but if it doesn't circulate effectively, well then, of course, you won't be able to convince and influence people. Sometimes this content will be polarizing, sometimes it will seek to confirm their preconceived opinions, and it will encourage them to share that content. Often it's misleading, there's clickbait involved with a decontextualizing of a particular situation that just is not verifiable. So there are a whole lot of strategies to get users to forward on content. Foreign interferers, I should say, have a better handle of the digital media that they are using. Mr. Waterhouse, you talked about computer hygiene and that human beings are the weak link when it comes to cybersecurity. Can you put people into categories, their age groups, their level of education in terms of their vulnerability, or is it homogeneous? Can you divide people up into categories, and can foreign actors exploit that fact? Response. Well, generally speaking, people use technology intuitively. So there's no formal training as to how to use, for example, the new model of someone's iPad. And folks will learn intuitively or by way of osmosis or from friends and colleagues. So the young population are the new electors. Well, they consume a lot of information through social media. And whereas if you look at a segment of the population that is older, for example, our seniors, well, of course, they won't be using the new technologies, but rather conventional media. And for middle-aged persons, of course, it's a mix of both. But to an extent, we are all vulnerable. Cyber hygiene means keeping your devices updated, protecting your social media accounts, and if these foreign agents do take a hold of someone's Facebook or social media account, well, they can influence the entourage of that individual or their friends, and in that sense, the friends are convinced because it seems to be coming from a verifiable source, i.e. their friends. So we need to address that issue. Mr. Bordelot, we talked about the issue of a threshold, and one gets the sense that this is binary. But is that threshold gradual in any way? When there's an attack or interference that's more limited, how do you go about that exactly? Should we be informing Canadians and Quebecers specifically about the warnings? Should we be attributing some sort of a warning label to forms of information? Well, yes, I do think that kind of labelling process would be helpful. And I referred to a study earlier. If information is disseminated that isn't verifiable or clear, well, it's easier to tweak that information and use it as a weapon against your fellow citizens to undermine confidence and trust in the democratic system. So a binary system has its drawbacks, of course. It's difficult to create a clear, straightforward, precise threshold, but I do think it's feasible, nevertheless, and that's something that should be envisaged. I don't have much time left, but if this threshold is reached, what is the risk of the public to the public? Could it further polarize the population? And what can we do to avoid that kind of further polarization? My question is for everyone. Response. Well, the best way of eliminating that risk is to have clear information. The public need to better understand the forms of foreign interference, and that the best vector for that communication is not from TikTok or from Mr. Musk, it is from the government bodies themselves. So if the information is verifiable and the security authorities share that information proactively, I think there'll be less of a risk because, in a sense, the government is controlling the dissemination of the information and its verifiability.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses who are here with us today to talk about this issue, which is incredibly challenging. And I think, you know, what we've heard again and again in testimony is how rapidly this changes. So it's like we're trying to find ways to block misinformation, to prevent any interference, but the target is moving all the time. And so I thought I would ask all of you a question, and I'll start with you and Ms. Roubiliard first, and then we'll go from there. All of you talked in some capacity about education and how to inform and keep Canadians aware of what's happening. And we know that's challenging because how people take information in is different. I know I represent more rural and remote riding, so there are parts of my riding where there is no accessibility to internet. And there are also parts of my writing where there is no media that is local that can inform you that is a trusted source. So it's an interesting dynamic. So when we look at how to educate Canadians, what would be the best advice that you could provide in terms of this constantly moving threat in a huge country that has different ways of communicating with one another and with Canadians?
Merci pour la...
Well, thank you for the question. It's a great question that you've just asked. Well, I don't agree with my colleagues here this evening to the extent that I don't believe that it should ultimately only be the responsibility of Canadians to get better educated and better informed. That's important, but I think that everyone needs to chip in and be part of this process. Now, since the onset of, since we saw interference in the presidential elections of 2016, Facebook put in place an advertising library and archives that can be consulted, specifically in relation to political issues. For example, you can look at the advertising that is circulating from political parties and the web pages of elected officials on Facebook and Instagram, which is now Meta. So it's Meta's library, the new name for Facebook. Now, when you look at the advertising, you realize that there are elected officials, elected representatives, and parties that are getting behind disinformation and misinformation. So they'll put content online, that content will circulate, and that will further polarize Canadians. And so that needs to be addressed. We need to do some housekeeping there. But the government also has a huge onus on it in terms of determining what that strategy should be. You have a better sense than a lot of everyday people of how social media works and how disinformation and misinformation circulates.
It's a great question the member put in, and I have to put in that Mrs. Grondin-Robillard said, yeah, it is a team effort that the The message has to be formatted at the top and then pushed down through the educational system. And I'm one who believes firmly that with the education is a provincial responsibility. We all know that. But then again, with a program that will be then prepared at the federal level, like for the citizenship of everyone, it could be then driven to all these provinces at a very low cost of integration and then put into the school system. Because you said it well, in rural areas, I'm from one of them, the preoccupation is not to be 24/7 in front of a TV set or whatever technological means. Sometimes it is in very, very remote areas of the country that they have so many minutes, and I call it minutes, from the satellite downlink to consume the information. So I relate to that. But then again, if it is embedded into the communities by, again, maybe not religious leaders, but with I believe the schooling system, the educational system, it will be much more worthwhile to push it down and make everybody aware and especially known about it. Just like economics is taught, the political system has also to be teach to everyone.
I think this is a great question, and certainly I think that I agree with the other witnesses here that this needs to be also not just a citizen level effort. This needs to be a government level effort as well. I think one of the ways that this can be achieved is through greater cooperation between security agencies, the site task force, political parties, members of this House as well, when it comes to understanding the threat landscape and understanding how information that you are consuming and you are sharing will be used and will be consumed by citizens. And so I think that there's certainly briefings that can be done, education material that can be put together to provide political parties and political campaigns and members of parliament with better tools and just an overall better toolbox to understand the effect of the information that they will be sharing with the citizens in their writings.
Thank you.
We'll now go with our second round of questions, and we'll have 5 minutes at Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold, 5 minutes, followed by Mr. Fergus. Mr. Berthold, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, and thank you to our 3 witnesses for being here. I'll be asking most of my questions of Mr. Waterhouse, but if you'd like to respond, just let me know, and I'll ask you some specific questions. Now, Mr. Waterhouse, you appeared before the Canada-China Committee in 2021, and you advised parliamentarians about the threat coming out of Beijing. Could you confirm the current threat landscape? Well, if you go back 10, 12 years, it's a completely different state of affairs to what we see nowadays. Response: yes, the threat has grown, in fact. Strategies go back to 2019. There was a book written in China, Unrestricted Warfare, that focused on how China should position itself and get the military and technological tools to infiltrate the West and ride roughshod over any rules and regulations, and then, in a sense, set up this network worldwide. So we've seen this influence propagate in Africa, in South America, and we're seeing the ramifications back home in Canada. Now, with artificial intelligence, threats are becoming exponential, aren't they? These countries are able to interfere exponentially in our elections. Well, yes, the reliance on artificial intelligence will have an exponential effect, but quite currently it's embryonic. That particular technology is dangerous in the sense that it generates false news verbally, visually, in the way it's written. It'll be very tough to discern truth from lies. And so we'll need to find a way of authenticating the source of messages. The Government of Canada, for example, has an infrastructure that it uses vis-à-vis the public in order to authenticate who the messenger is. I have so many questions. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but it's because I have just so many questions to ask of you. There's a lot of talk about foreign interference, of course, and one presumes that it comes from abroad. But we're noting that there are a lot of diplomats from a particular communist regime that are here in Canada. Now, if foreign agents are operating in Canada, can they be identified as foreign agents? Well, that individual might be back in their home country and they might be simulating a presence on Canadian or American soil. Now, if you try and gelocate the source of information, it will be difficult because sometimes it comes from an allied country. And therefore, it's really difficult when it comes to managing the source of the information. Elections Canada, in its departmental plans, has announced that it's going to increasingly rely on certain technologies when it comes to polling offices and voter lists. Is Canada ready for this new approach? And will it constitute a further threat to our democratic process? Well, Elections Canada had to assess the threats and risks with the assistance of the Telecommunications Centre, which is responsible for telecommunications security in Canada, and they validate the InfoCloud technologies, that they are in line with the standards established in Canada. And therefore, that's particularly important when it comes to elector lists. Once this information is in the cloud, it should be considered safe. But then other people can get their hands on it sometimes. Well, there are 200 polling officers that would have access to that info cloud. Once the information leaves the cloud, and that's when the risk is higher. Is that correct? Yes, that's true. In previous years, we used to get electoral lists in our letterboxes, and there was very little electoral interference. But now we have a wealth of information online, and it's easier to commit fraud. What should we be wary of when it comes to applications that are being wielded by hostile regimes? Which are the worst culprits in terms of apps? Can I respond, Madam Chair? The worst ones are those from outside Canada. They own those applications, and we've seen this. They use these applications as vectors for influence. They will send out messages to benefit them to a whole host of recipients. So, for example, TikTok in China generates educational information in North America and in the Western world, generally speaking. TikTok is used as a form of entertainment. And these 15, 30-second messages are very convincing and compelling for the individuals who are using those media. And they spend a lot of time on those apps. They consume that information vociferously. And therefore, that makes it a really dangerous place for the propagation of false information.
Mr. Fergus.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. I'd really like to thank all of our witnesses here today. It's been fascinating to date. And I think that you've shared a lot of gems of information with us today. My question is directed at Ms. de Bordelot and Ms. Grandin-Robillard, but Mr. Waterhouse, please chime in if you wish. My question is about the studies on the influence of Russia in the US elections of 2016. What lessons should we learn from that interference by way of social media? Thank you very much for the question. There are a lot of lessons to learn, generally speaking. In my master's thesis, I noted that there were a lot of publications that were coming out of Russia that were circulating, and that they didn't. That false information was continuing to be propagated. And unfortunately, that information is still appearing on Instagram, even though the election is over. It's remaining part of the political rhetoric and the landscape of rhetoric, and we can find the references to that when it comes to American politics. Question. So what you're saying is that they're going to continue to have influence on future elections? Yes, they have an influence over American democratic system in general. A lot of this information has to do with Donald Trump, the American army, issues such as the right to choose. And unfortunately, that area of the internet hasn't been cleaned up. Meta should have done so, but it hasn't done so. Mr. Bordeaux, would you like to comment on that? Well, the lesson is about the importance of the politicization of information, which is used to interfere in elections. It's kind of the first time that we've seen this kind of interference, and that was in the US election. We saw that there was a lot of damage done because of the interference itself on the part of Russia, and also by the political actors within the United States who rehashed that misinformation about interference and weaponized that politically, and used it to attack the culture of confidence that Americans had in the democratic process. Are we seeing that play out in Canada? Well, since November, my answer would be yes, we are seeing that. Ms. Grandet-Robillard. Well, I agree with my colleague. I wouldn't have a specific answer that I could give to that question. I defer to my colleague. Mr. Waterhouse, you have a lot of experience about within the government apparatus. What would your input be? Well, given that election agencies are independent, they normally verify the information with intelligence sources, but it's very difficult to check and double-check the information and to determine whether there's been any improvement. But what I can tell you is that if we look at our allies' elections across the world, there is foreign interference, and those foreign actors will continue to interfere in order to meet their ends. I only have about 40 seconds left, but very quickly, if I may. Are the institutions and the tools that we've developed as a country here in Canada up to the task? Are they adequate? And if not, what other tools do we need in our toolbox? Well, yes, I can take a stab at that. Adequate? No. And under the Elections Modernisation Act, I think we are going to make some headway. But one point that I often raise is this. We need interagency cooperation. Currently, the site task force is a source of cooperation between 4 departments. In Australia, there are over 10 departments and government institutions and organisations that collaborate. Currently in Canada, there's no financial expert that's part of the site task force when it comes to election integrity, so that's a weakness. Mr. Waterhouse did nod his head in approval of their answers, but he didn't have an opportunity to chime in. But I think he agreed with what Mr. Bordeaux just said, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Madame Normandie.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Now, when it comes to alerting the population, and if, for example, the population believes that this interference isn't legitimate, what of that danger of a kind of and we had witnessed before the ethics committee that talked about the establishment of a permanent ethics bureau that would act in a sense like the Auditor General, that would be non-partisan and report back to the House. Would that kind of body be helpful in alerting the population when there is interference? Would that be more transparent, and would Canadians and Quebecers trust that kind of organisation? Well, it's a very good suggestion, but it needs to be arm's length and transparent. It should be independent from Elections Canada, for example. But there shouldn't be too much information, too many sources of information. But as I said, it needs to be independent of any other form of interference, and it would need to verify the veracity of any information. But who would be mandated to carry out that job? Well, obviously, that individual would need to be completely apolitical. I agree entirely. In an ideal world, we'd have a kind of an Auditor General who would work hand in hand with analysts from various government organisations, the CSIS, the Communications Security Establishment, Elections Canada, and with the assistance of those individuals and organisations, it would be easier to determine what information should be disclosed and how it should be disclosed. So, in that sense, it would be good if the entity reported back to the House of Commons rather than to the government per se. Is that correct? Yes, the CEO of the elections does report back to the House of Commons, for example, so something similar to that.
Merci, Madame Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to come to you first, Mr. Bordelot. I think one of the challenges is looking at how do you inform Canadians, how do you keep the information clear, and how do you not disrupt national security so that we continue to get the information that we rightfully need. And I hear what you're saying, that it needs to be arm's length. But I guess what you mentioned in your presentation, the fact that we need a legislative response to that. So I know that I don't expect you to write the legislation right now in front of us, although that would be very helpful. But what are the key things that we need to have in that legislation? I know there's other countries that are doing that work, but what are the key things that are going to help Canadians have faith in the system, but also protect our ability to collect information so that we can protect the dignity of our democracy?
That's an excellent question. I think foreign interference comes from there's different techniques. It comes from a wide range of different fields, from finance to information, as we've talked about, and plenty of other potential techniques. And so I think that's why when it comes to what information needs to be made available to the public, I don't think I can answer that question fully. I think only experts in those specific techniques, in those specific fields, would be able. In terms of information, which is something that I can speak of, I would say, and I've said it before, it needs to be clear. In the case of Australia, for instance, when they make information regarding foreign interference in elections public, they talk very specifically about investigations that have been concluded and that are not ongoing. So right here, we are addressing the fact that this isn't going to compromise national security because these are investigations that have been terminated. And so the information is also very clear in saying that X did Y with the objective of achieving this. And so the information, the objectives of the agent are made very, very clear. And I think this is the best way to approach the
I don't
topic.
have a lot but time left, but you talked about having on that site multiple people signing off on the information, but we also just talked about having sort of an independent branch that maybe gives the information. So I'm a little confused about which direction would be wisest.
If I may, it's so basically it is an independent task force, but there are members within that task force that come from a wide variety of expertise and departments. Department of Finance in Australia, the Treasury Board, the Security Services. So it comes from a wide range of individuals from a wide range of expertise.
I'm going to suggest, because you have such a good wealth of information in that head, maybe an extended answer sent to the clerk, and we can circulate that around. That way we'll get the details. Thank you so much. Mr. Nader for 2 minutes, followed by Mrs. Sahota, and then we'll be on our way.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and then through you, thank you to our witnesses for joining us. It's been a fruitful conversation, and honestly wish we could have a little bit more time with these witnesses, but that's always the challenge with these types of meetings. I want to begin with Monsieur Borderlow, and just follow up on some of your expertise comparing the Five Eyes countries, and it's been mentioned a little bit, but the idea of a foreign influence registry here in Canada, consultations are ongoing. Earlier today, a Liberal-appointed senator sent out an open letter with quite some interesting observations on it, frankly, in opposition to such a registry. Obviously, there's been suggestions that this should exist in Canada. One of our former colleagues went so far as to table legislation on such a matter. But from your experience and looking at our Five Eyes colleagues, what is the significance of such a registry? Why have some of our international colleagues gone down that route, and what benefit does that hold for Canada as we undertake these consultations?
That's an excellent question, and so as not to waste time, I'm going to be really brief in saying that I'm not an expert on foreign agent registries. I have done a bit of research on it, but I think the consultations, of which I am a part of, are going to, the reports that are going to come from those consultations are going to do a much better job at explaining what should and shouldn't be done in that regard. But I think it's a good idea that we are considering it, if I may.
No, I appreciate that, and look forward to any information comes to that. In your opening comments, or actually in response to one of our questions, you talked a little bit about the idea of controlled transparency. What safeguards would you like to see put in place to safeguard some of that controlled transparency?
Could you clarify the question, please?
Well, you talk about how some of our international counterparts have a controlled transparency in terms of the information that is released. There's somewhat certain controls on in terms of how and what gets released. You had mentioned that it wasn't quite at verifiable information. So I just wanted you to clarify that a little bit in terms of what safeguards ought to be in place when that information is being released.
Well, I think first of all, the information needs to be clear, of course, and needs to not be a concern for national security, as was discussed. I think also it needs to come from a strong, reliable, independent source that isn't affiliated and that potentially could report to the House of Commons. I think that would be an ideal situation for sure. And I think that having a clear threshold in that sense that this independent organization or this independent group could make a clear threshold that is made public to the House of Commons. I think that would be beneficial for sure.
Thank you. Mrs. Sahota, 2 minutes and 45 seconds.
Thank you. Just going off that a little bit, because the Australian model is recommended highly by yourself, Mr. Bordelot, and other witnesses that have come before the committee. But the feedback that we've been reading in some articles isn't all positive. So we want to make sure that we learn from the lessons of Australia as well. And in a recent article published last month about Australia's foreign registry, it outlined that the Confucius Institute at 13 colleges were not included on the registry, but the Canadian Pension Plan is. To quote the article, an agnostic law that applies the same to democracies like Canada as autocracies like Russia, plus lax enforcement, have made the scheme largely ineffective, argued by a lawyer, Mr. Ward, who was a senior advisor to two former Australian prime ministers on the initiative. Do you have any comments on the Australian registry, and what are some lessons that we can learn about that? Quickly, I have one other follow-up.
No, absolutely. I just want to be clear, there's a difference between the transparency scheme in Australia and the foreign registry in Australia. So just to make sure, because I've talked about both, and I want to make sure that this is about the registry. I think there have certainly been some failures and weaknesses with the registry in Australia, chief among which you've mentioned, and also preventing international organizations from working within Australia because of their work in other countries such as China. And so I do think that those negative points need to be taken into consideration when considering a registry here in Canada for sure.
Okay.
It's not all positive.
Another quick question. Based off of a question I asked before about our media ecosystem, the government's been putting in place measures like online news acts and other things to try to make sure that we have public broadcasting as well as other news outlets for Canadians. Do you think that closures that we're seeing globally is contributing to the rise in disinformation and misinformation? And should the government be doing more to protect our media sources?
Est-ce que vous pouvez clarifier la question?
Should the government be involved? Just like you're saying that the government should have like a website to clarify length agency. My issue lies that, we've been doing things like that, but then it's often criticized as, let's just say it's a government-funded news source, or, there's support that the government gives. The news agency's independence is automatically questioned at that point. Similar to that, Mr. David Johnson, who has great integrity, is also being questioned as being the special rapporteur on this assigned this new task. So where do how does the government implement things? Obviously, the government would be paying for these agencies to run a system like this. How do we do that and yet keep the integrity and the independence of those people, systems, and journalists?
Je pense que l'important, c'est de...
What is important is for us to remain transparent and also to remind that when there are blames or criticism as the ones which were leveled to CBC, is to give a reminder of how the channels are being funded. This is what CRTC does. And that might perhaps remind some people the modalities of funding other channels. And more transparency also over there would be a good idea. Thank you indeed. If you have other comments.
No time left, as you've indicated. Would they be able to provide that in a written response? The answer to that question?
Interesting enough, that's what I was going to say.
Perfect. Okay.
Great minds think
So
alike.
am I.
Sorry.
So as I do at the end of every single panel, but I know it's our first meeting on foreign election interference, so people might not know this, but if you have anything to add to your comments or something else comes up later on at night, please do send them to the clerk, and the clerk will make sure that they are distributed to all members. With that very insightful conversation, really grateful for the work that you do and the time that you've taken to be here. It really does mean a lot to our committee. So on behalf of all PROC committee members, thank you so much and have a good night. We will suspend for 2 minutes. We have to do a sound check for one of our witnesses next who will be online, and we have one in person. So 2-minute suspension and we will continue. Thank you. continue with our next panel. We have with us Madame Sophie Marino, PhD Doctorate International Relations, and joining us by video conference. We also have Ms. Laurie Turnbull, Associate Professor, Director, School of Public Administration, Dalhousie University. I would like to thank you both for being with us here today, with us this evening. And you will each have 4 minutes for an opening statement, after which we will proceed to questions from committee members. And on va commencer avec vous, Madame.
We'll start with you, Ms. Marino, and welcome. My name is Sophie Marino, and I'm a PhD student in the history of international relations at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and I specialize in Russian foreign policy. In the last few years, my work has focused on the war in Ukraine, the effectiveness of Western sanctions, and the use of disinformation as a foreign policy tool, most notably in the 2016 and 2020 US elections. The study of Russian interference in the US election is relevant in that it should not be seen as an isolated phenomenon, but rather as a more widespread one. Russian interference in the last US election was so extensive, particularly through social media networks, that platforms such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit were held accountable for how Russians infiltrated their platforms to conduct massive disinformation campaigns and undermine Americans' trust in their electoral system and government institutions. The reports from Twitter and Facebook detailing the methods used are detailed enough to serve as a point of reference for other actors. For example, China vis-à-vis Canada. In the US, investigations have also revealed that the disinformation campaigns and attacks have not been confined to social media, but have also translated into real-life violence. The FBI was able to demonstrate interference in the organization of the Charlottesville rally in 2017, where supporters of the alt-right and the Black Lives Matter movement clashed, resulting in 3 deaths and nearly 50 injuries. At the same time, Russians have also been linked to the organization of a rally in Houston, Texas, where a Texas nationalist movement and the United Muslims of America movement clashed, again leading to violent incidents. Disinformation and Russian interference have served several parallel objectives: to create chaos, to undermine Americans' confidence in their electoral system and institutions, and finally to try to influence the elections so that the party in power will be more sympathetic to Russia. Foreign interference in all of its forms often blurs the traditional lines of conflict or attack by another country, making it all the more complicated to combat. As we've seen in the United States, the work of governments alone is not enough to stop interference. The government cannot position itself as the only bulwark protecting us from these all-out attacks. Interference must be exposed. Media platforms, social networks, institutions and the general public must be made aware of this phenomenon. It is through a collective effort that Canada will be best able to protect itself from foreign interference. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci à vous.
Thank you.
On continue avec Madame Turnbull.
Ms. Turnbull, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I'll just make a few opening comments. The issue of foreign interference in elections has gained prominence in Canadian politics as of late, due largely to concerns about the possibility of such interference in certain ridings in the 2019 and 2021 elections. Moreover, recent leaks of classified intelligence that decry a failure to act on the threat of foreign interference have contributed to a sense of urgency around the issue. We all know that foreign interference in elections is not new. That said, it is taking new forms because foreign actors have an increased capacity to interfere, particularly through the use of digital technologies and social media. According to a Government of Canada publication entitled Foreign Interference Threats to Canada's Democratic Process, foreign interference includes attempts to covertly influence, intimidate, manipulate, interfere, corrupt, or discredit individuals, organizations, and governments to further the interests of a foreign country. Simply put, foreign interference comes down to attempts to clandestinely influence political decisions and outcomes. You have testimony from others who are far more qualified to tell you about the nature and specifics of foreign threats. I'm a political scientist who studies parliament, elections, political attitudes and behavior, and public and political institutions broadly, so my comments will be focused on the health of democracy inside Canada and our ability, or lack thereof, to fend off threats, whether foreign or domestic. I'm going to start with an obvious point, and I don't have to convince you of this point. Elections are important, really important. They are the primary mechanisms by which, as a sovereign country, we decide for ourselves. The legitimacy of governments and their decisions rests with a fairness, both real and perceived, of the processes that elect people to office. As elected members, you don't need me to explain this to you, but I raise this point because we need to bear in mind how any threat to the perception or reality of the proper administration of elections, whether from a foreign or domestic source, undermines our capacity to decide for ourselves. We can't take this matter lightly. The report that I referenced earlier describes our democratic institutions and electoral system as strong. Sadly, I think this statement requires qualification. I don't want to overemphasize the problems. We have much to be proud of, including a long history of free and fair elections as administered by independent elections offices in Canada and in the provinces and territories. We have many examples to point to of how governments are held to account in meaningful ways and subject to regulations and political processes based on transparency, including the recent inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act. This is a time where the Prime Minister of Canada and the people who are most powerful around him were held to account and had to answer questions in public. This doesn't happen in the absence of democratic values and institutions. That said, our democracy needs a shot in the arm. We need to have a hard look at what works and what doesn't. Voter turnout is a clear indicator of a hollowness in our electoral democracy. Only 43.5% of voters participated in the last provincial election in Ontario. With such a low level of participation, the relative threat of foreign interference is greater. Our democracy is increasingly lacking of a center of gravity that comes only with widespread participation and engagement. Without this stabilizing factor, we are less able to fend off threats and attempts to mislead and intimidate. It is shocking how many Canadians feel politically orphaned. In a functioning democracy, this shouldn't happen. Democracies are supposed to work like markets. There is an incentive for politicians and parties to give people what they want. But when most people switch off and aren't engaged, those who are selling political products have an incentive to play on the margins and to court opinions that would not survive in a robust political marketplace, but are firmly held by a motivated few. This is democracy gone bad. We need a proper filtering process for ideas, and this can only happen when a strong majority of people participate. Don't get me wrong, I don't advocate for the tyranny of the majority. That can have and has had disastrous results. But democracies can only handle so much apathy before they stop functioning, and I think we're there now. Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to start our first round, 6-minute rounds, and it will start with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mr. Turnbull, puis Madame Normandin, suivi par Madame
And Ms. Normandin.
Followed by Ms. Blaney.
Who will be speaking. Just to remember, we have 2 official languages, so that if we can just be mindful of the speed in which we speak, that would be excellent. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to direct my questions to Professor Turnbull. Although there has been a lot of focus as of late of Beijing's election interference in the 2019 and 21 elections, during the 2015 election, there was also foreign interference or foreign money that was directed to third-party organizations that were registered. For example, in 2017, I wrote to the Commissioner of Elections Canada with a complaint in which I had identified that a total of $693,023.50 had been transferred from the Tides Foundation, which is based in California, to 8 different third-party groups: Council of Canadians, Dogwood Initiative, Ecology Ottawa, Equiterre, Greenpeace Canada, Toronto 350, the West Coast Environmental Law Association, and the West Coast Environmental Law Research Foundation. None of that was reported by any of those 8 third-party groups. They did spend a total of $317,426.80 in the 2015 election. And in short, when Elections Canada responded, they said effectively there's nothing they can do because of certain loopholes that existed in the legislation at that time. The government did move forward to amend the Canada Elections Act with fairly significant amendments in Bill C-76. I know you did appear, I think, at this committee on Bill C-76. The Chief Electoral Officer, in his report on the 43rd and 44th elections, does, in a section, speak about some of the issues around third parties, in which he does note that there are some of these loopholes that still exist, at least two. One is that there's a melding issue. That was an issue with respect to my 2017 complaint, in which funds donated to a third party, even from a foreign source, can be treated as melded and as part of the general revenue of the third party. And then a second loophole is that a third party can accept contributions from another entity, report having received those funds from that entity, even though those funds may have come from another source. So that's a long preamble, but I think it's important to provide some context in terms of loopholes or gaps that exist within the Canada Elections Act. So I know you have studied the Act, you've appeared as a witness. Do you have any recommendations on how we can strengthen the Canada Elections Act to stop the flow of foreign money?
I think that when it comes to third parties, it's particularly difficult, and I appreciate the question. Thank you, because they tend to function as multi-purpose kind of organizations, where they might be getting all kinds of money from all kinds of people and organizations from different places, depending on what their primary function is. And then when it switches to a campaign period and they become engaged in an electoral process, it's a question of how do they then use, the melding issue, I think, that you identify as the important one, because if they've got a general revenue supply and then they start to shift towards campaign spending, how do you then start to pay very close attention to the activities of a third party and which of them, how much money and what kind of money is being flowed toward campaign activities, and which of it is preserved for their organizational purpose, which happens and exists all the time. I think at the same time, you don't want to get to the point where you're auditing to the point of granularity that you deter the activities of the organization and they don't want to function at all. And so I think it's important. Educational aspects are important. It's important to talk to third parties about being compliant. It's about trying to make sure people are aware of what the rules are and what they require. And apart from that, I mean, I think, again, it's difficult when you start to look at some of these third parties are not that. Some of them are working primarily as political entities, and they don't necessarily have big purposes outside. So as far as what's there, sometimes I get concerned because there seems to be a bit of a lack of concern around the activities of third parties sometimes. And you can see it in some jurisdictions, for example, in Ontario. There can be court cases that remove the rules around third parties or create, the possibility of not a level playing field. I think that would be very bad. And so I'm thinking it's important to keep the rules we have. But again, we're always catching up, I think. There's always, the activity that's going on, and the law, the regulations are always a bit of a step behind in trying to figure out how to be compliant. In-kind contributions is another challenge, because that's much harder to trace in the flow of money.
So do you have, I take it from your answer, that you don't have any suggestions in terms of amendments to the Act to deal with the melding issue, or is there something that you have in mind? Because it seems like when we're talking about, $317,000 spent, nearly $700,000 that went into just 8 groups, and there were other groups, but those were 8 where money went directly from tides into the aid. And that was all in 2015, right in months leading up to an election in which all of those organizations took, to one degree or another, a fairly active role in taking a position in the 2015 campaign.
But that was 2015, so the rules have changed since then.
Yeah, but the issue is still, the loophole, the melding issue remains, so.
Apart from transparency, I'm not sure what you can do. Apart from making it so miserable for a third party to contribute to political conversation that they don't want to do it at all, and I don't think that's a better thing.
Thank you. Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to Professor Turnbull and Miss, I'm sorry, I forgot her first name, and Ms. Marneau for being here today. We appreciate your testimony. Professor Turnbull, I know in your opening remarks I think I agreed with everything you said, although I was a little shocked by the last statement, that sort of the apathy comment you made, that we're sort of there, and sounds like from your perspective things are getting pretty bad. I think, from all of our work in this committee on this topic, I think our government has been making strides all along the way to address the evolving threat environment. That's not to say that we can't do a lot more, which I think is the very legitimate concern that we all bring, an authentic concern that we bring to this work in taking every threat seriously to our democracy. And I think you share that sentiment, or shared that sentiment in your opening remarks. So I definitely relate to that. In terms of, how this committee and some of these conversations have become overly heated, I know that you had made some comments about some of the things that the leader of the official opposition made, calling it overheated rhetoric, I believe, and making some unfounded allegations at the time. I just, for me, I'm wondering if you can expand on that, just in the sense that I think we really need to tone this down, in my view, and really focus on what measures would really enhance our democracy. Would you not agree?
I would agree with that, and I think that's what's really important. Is at this point, I think we're in the middle of a process where Mr. Johnston will make some recommendations about how to deal with this issue. It could include a public inquiry or not. I would be really sad if he doesn't make a recommendation for a public inquiry that is broad, not just about foreign interference, because I don't think that's the right place to deal with foreign interference issues as a kind of fact-finding mission, because you can't say everything in public. I think it's more important to have a much broader conversation at this point about the health of democracy as measured by a number of indicators. So for me, to try to be quick in answering your question, if we thought about things like should we bring back the per vote subsidy for political parties so that they have stable funding that they can count on year over year? Would that bring some kind of stability? Are we seeing some inflamed rhetoric because parties are very heavily dependent on private donations, for example, and maybe some of that would have that toned down effect that you talk about? Would it be a good idea to lower the voting age to 16 and recognize that 16-year-olds are actually quite capable of making these sorts of decisions and having conversations about things that affect all of us, and that type of inclusion and conversation matched with robust civics classes across the country would maybe then change the dialogue, because I think we're more responsible when we have conversations with teenagers and younger people. We're not as nasty. I hope we're not. And so sometimes that can have a really good effect. I think we need to be talking about things like how to recruit and retain people in public office, how to make it less of a miserable experience for a lot of people. I think we have to talk about how we can build our own civic self-defense so that we can tell the difference between truth and lies, no matter who is throwing them out there. And when you build those things, you don't necessarily have to say things like, we are going to censor divisive rhetoric. We can't do that. We can't do that. We have to make other things different so that that becomes much less marketable and much less common.
Mm-hmm. Those are interesting ideas, and I appreciate those sentiments and comments. I guess based on the last panel, which I found really interesting, I noticed you happened to be in the back of the room and listening in. I'm struck by just how much the tools that we use to consume information have changed our democracy fundamentally. And that it's not even a slow drip of information that we're consuming, it's a fast drip. It's like we're sucking on the fire hose of information. And it's interesting just how that changes the discourse. I find it troubling to think and to hear from multiple witnesses that we're not able to determine what is true from what is false in that online information space and consuming it in the way that we do. Do you have any ideas about how we can address that? Because it seems to me that is really the forefront of the threat environment that we haven't yet responded to. We've heard about it in terms of the CSIS Act. Wondered whether you have any ideas.
I think to go after a certain, to try to sort of identify what is truth from what is not truth, you'd think that would be an easy process. You think people would agree on the difference between truth and falsehood, but we don't anymore. And so I think things like education, those things are really important. But that's not an easy fix. That's something that happens over time. I think doing what we can to try to increase the voter turnout and sense of engagement in politics more broadly. That's really important, because what's happening is when you get so few people participating and so many people think that they're political orphans, they want to vote, they want to engage, and they're looking around and they think nobody here is matching what I want. That's a problem. That is a system malfunction. We shouldn't have that. We shouldn't have parties who do not, see why it's important to appeal to that kind of sense of consensus, because we don't see the consensus anymore. And so I think I have the kind of long game kinds of answers around making sure that, for example, people are getting exposure to what our democratic values are at a very young age, and then going forward, so that you're ready for this kind of thing and you can handle.
Thank you.
Ms. Normandin, 6 minutes. Thank you very much. I'll have questions for both witnesses, but I'll start with you, Ms. Turnbull, if I may. You've already answered a number of questions. Can you hear the interpretation? Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. This is the interpretation channel. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. This is the interpretation channel. Testing, 1, 2, 3. This is the English interpretation. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. We'll start again. And of course, I'll give you back any time that's taken up with lag from interpretation, Ms. Normandin. Please start from the beginning. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. As I was saying, I'll have questions for both witnesses, but I'll start with you, Ms. Turnbull. You've already answered questions that I was going to ask about public financing of political parties. I'd like you to elaborate on that, please. I understand that that would make parties more independent from private financing and possibly from foreign interference. Should we also reduce the maximum amount of possible contributions? What are your thoughts, please?
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. I think this is a fascinating topic. I'm going to take the last part first. I do not think that we should lower the contribution limit, because it's already quite low. And if we lower that, I just don't see what that would accomplish. I don't think that, for example, if it's around, I think, 1650, 1700, if you got lower than that, you wouldn't be achieving anything. I really don't think there's an issue by way of any negative outcome that's going to happen at a $1,700 level that would be different if we allowed $1,400. I just don't see it, and most political contributions are nowhere near in that ballpark. Last I saw these statistics, it was less than $200, and so what we would accomplish by doing that, I really have no idea. I think there's perhaps an optimal balance. Maybe this is a conceptual thing, between the amount of money that political parties will get from private sources and the amount of money that will get public. So you want political parties to want to compete for donations. That is a test around whether or not they're resonating with the public. That is accountability for political parties. If you're raising money, it should be because your ideas resonate. That's not always the way it works. On the other hand, the public funding is not, I don't see that as an investment really in a particular party. It's an investment in a party system. It's an investment in a competition. And we need to make sure, I think, that even though you don't want to make parties entirely reliant on that, because we shouldn't have taxpayer, consolidated revenue fund paying entirely for political parties' contributions and competitions, I think there's value in investing in a democracy to make sure, again, you can see parties kind of go over time and be able to count on a certain amount of funding. Otherwise, how you did in the last election is too much of a determinant in how you do going forward. And then we get a kind of, self-fulfilling situation, which I don't think is valuable.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Ms. Marino, I'll alternate between both witnesses. Ms. Marino, you referred to the fact that there are different platforms, Google and so on, that have had to be accountable about how they've been infiltrated. And this is serving as a model for state actors who are seeking to engage in interference. Could you elaborate on this? We need to strike a balance between transparency vis-à-vis the public and not tipping off these foreign state actors who might want to interfere in our elections. And of course, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, please. Well, yes, indeed. Since 2016, there have been a whole wealth of reports released on this issue. And that has helped these wrongdoers. There are armies of bots that were sharing reams of information, and this army of bots were quickly deactivated by platforms such as Google and Twitter. So they've developed more sophisticated ways of acting, and they're less visible, these bots. So, for example, I might create an account myself on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and then I link up the accounts and give people the sense that I am just one single person. A bot, for example, wouldn't have any profile information or a photo, of course, is easier to identify than that kind of thing. So if we are able to expose these wrongdoers, they will become more sophisticated, but at least the population will have a heightened awareness, and they'll be more careful on Instagram and Facebook when they see individuals repeating the same thing. Well, they'll have more of a critical analysis of that. Of course, this will take time. We're all getting used to this new online space. Thank you very much. You also said that it's not enough for governments to counter interference. There need to be other stakeholders and players. Some ideas, please. Earlier, witnesses spoke about a permanent entity to counter foreign interference that would be akin to the Auditor General and report to the House of Commons. Is that a kind of tool that might be useful to counter interference, in your opinion? Response: yes, it could be a good tool. But if Canadians lose faith in their institutions and the electoral process, the best way to share information in our ideal world is if everyone is sharing the same information. So if it comes from a non-partisan organisation, from a government, from multiple sources, well, that will heighten credibility, and Canadians will be able to better trust that information. The more trust we have in our systems, the more difficult it will be able to target the vulnerable, and by way of these various social media strategies and so on and so forth.
Merci. Madame Blaney.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I thank both the witnesses for being here today to participate in this study and for their interesting testimony. I'm going to start with Ms. Marino first. One of the challenges, I think, as we address the issue of foreign interference in elections is how it's constantly changing, and it's hard to figure out the best way to respond when every response has to mitigate the challenges that we're faced with. When you were testifying before us, you talked about foreign interference needing to be addressed collectively, not just by the government, but all areas that are impacted. And I guess I have a two-piece question. One is, we're hearing from multiple people that legislation is really the tool that we need to be looking at. So when you look at foreign interference and disinformation, what are the holes in our legislation that we need to fill? And then the second part of that question is, I've also heard, and I think this is an interesting idea, is the focus is tending to be right on the election as opposed to looking at elections and then in between elections and how we address information. So we're not sort of not addressing misinformation and then suddenly right before and during an election we're panicking about it without a real resolution. So I'm just wondering if you could answer that very simple question.
Oui.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So I'd like to clarify that I'm not an expert in Canadian legislation. Obviously, the government's contribution by way of legislation is helpful. When I talked about a collective effort, I said that the government shouldn't be the only bulwark. Disinformation is constant. When it comes to Russia, for example, the RAND research group compared them to a fire hose of propaganda, these Russian wrongdoers. It is relentless and it is faster than any single organization that is trying to protect itself against that kind of misinformation. And this is done by way of bots. And a technique that is often used is this. There's a whole lot of information that is propagated. They see what acts as a hook, and then anything that doesn't act as a hook is discarded. And then they tweak their approach as to how to better share the information that will serve as a hook. So they're able to adapt and turn on a dime. When I talked about a collective effort, I meant that, yes, we need a broader awareness of these issues. We need to get informed as individuals. And each and every time when we read information, we need to have a critical analysis. Do I have the tools to validate, to verify the veracity of this information? Obviously, the government can contribute by way of legislation, and the platforms need to verify the information, and as individuals, we also need to protect ourselves. Let me now tackle the second part of your question. Could you repeat that, please, actually?
It's about addressing some of these issues in between elections. The focus right now is really on election specific, but we've heard other testimony where even parties have said, like, if there was more check-ins during the elections. And I also think about just educating people, because it's, again, for the public, it must feel like suddenly, like, there's always some information about disinformation, but it intensifies around elections. So how do we sort of build that capacity in between elections, I guess is what I'm asking.
So generally speaking, based on the research on Russia, that is, Russia often inflamed debates that were already hot-button issues. Russia sought to sow divisiveness, for example, in the United States on ethnicity, and in that sense to sow division. So I think we should think about how to, of course, put a finger on disinformation, how to go about it, but also ask ourselves what kind of debates may be inflammatory, what kind of issues will foreign actors try and interfere on?
Come to you, Professor Bowl. I really appreciated what you had to say about the health of democracy. And I know when I was last in the riding, I spent about a little over an hour with a bunch of teenagers between the ages of 15 and 17, and they had really hard questions, and it was really fantastic to see the engagement. So I'm a big supporter of getting younger people to engage with the system, because all the evidence tells us that the sooner a person engages with the system, the more they continue to vote. And if they don't engage very quickly, they don't participate. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about ways to, why this is a good idea and how you think it will increase elections connection. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think there are a number of things that we could do to increase turnout, but also just increase how inclusive the conversation is. And I really think, like 20 years ago when people were doing research on why the turnout had tanked in the early 2000s, a lot of these issues came up, right? So if you voted in your first eligible election, you were more likely to vote for the rest of your life. If you felt that the election wasn't a foregone conclusion, it was competitive, you were more likely to vote. The more informed you were, the more likely you were to vote. So all of these things. And so they all seem to me to point to, why don't we pair, a 16, let people vote when they're 16, tie that in with some sort of civics. She's telling me I have to stop now, but you know where I'm going with this, to try to, increase your information and your opportunity to participate at the same time.
Thank you. I was trying to not tell you, and then you told everybody anyways, because there's hundreds of thousands of people watching. But we appreciate that. Our next round will be 5 minutes to Mr. Nader, suivi par 5 minutes à Mr. Fergus.
5 minutes, Mr. Fergus, after that.
Madam Chair, and appreciate those hundreds of thousands of Canadians who are tuning in at 8:16 on a Tuesday evening. But through you, Madam Chair, to our witnesses, I want to begin with Dr. Turnbull in the room here. Certainly, you have a unique background in the sense that you've spent several years in academia, but you also had the window into the public service side of things through your time at the Privy Council office and the nonpartisan public service. And you've been on record, and you've mentioned again tonight of how you would like to see, or you think it's worthwhile to have a public inquiry. I think you said you would be sad if that recommendation didn't come out of David Johnston's review. So I was hoping you could put back on your PCO hat for just a minute, and if you were at PCO, and you've touched on this a little bit, if you were recommending to the government what the terms of reference ought to be for such a public inquiry. One of the responses we had from Ms. Telford is that one of the challenges would be to create these terms of reference. So if you were in that position, what terms of reference would you encourage the government to have for such an inquiry?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. At the risk of being I'm going to be very clear and say that I am not at PCO. I am not going to put that hat on, but I will, from the hat that I do wear, I will say it's hard to determine exactly how you're going to draw parameters around an exercise like this. I think there's kind of two general ways you can go. One way is you can be very specific. We are going to have an inquiry that answers these specific questions, and you don't get a lot of veering off. And so it has the upshot of being clear. It's maybe easier to have, especially given the timeline is not very long, it might be easier to be very focused on the questions that you want answered so that you're achieving that kind of clear objective. On the other hand, if you want to have a more broad process where you're defining parameters around how can we measure the health of democracy, and what sorts of factors are we looking at, and what can we do to improve that? The value of an inquiry like this is really going to be about the recommendations, because that people will literally flip to the back to say, what do you think we should do, though? And so I think getting to the point where, especially given that it's not going to be very much time, be solutions-oriented. What is it that you want to recommend to make things better? And based on what research and evidence?
Thank you for that. And maybe just following up briefly, talking about timelines and the potential short timelines and how broad or how targeted an inquiry ought to be or might be. Is there benefit if a broader inquiry is recommended, that there are interim reports with those recommendations that everyone flips to, specifically focus on this smaller aspect, important aspect on foreign interference? Is that could be a first part of a more broad inquiry with an interim report with interim recommendations sooner, being that we're almost 2 years into a hung parliament and there could be an election at any point, in theory at least.
Yes, that'll be interesting if for whatever reason the timelines end up crashing and an election happens before this thing is over. But I think that it would be interim reports make a lot of sense, particularly if there's going to be public engagement in this. I think it's important, especially if it does go the way of having a really a broad conversation around democracy, what's wrong with it, and what we can do. That will have much less value if people aren't engaged in it. So you need the interim reporting so that you can actually have moments where you're reaching out to people, but not necessarily for interim recommendations. I think probably the recommendations would come at the end after you've talked to people. So if you've got an interim, you're check in with people, have a public engagement side of it so that people are actually contributing and they know it's happening. That's going to be really hard given that this is going on over the summer.
Thanks for that. I wanted now, I've got about a minute left, focus on some of the governance issues and what we've heard from different witnesses, especially in the last few meetings, about the CEIPP, the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol. And one of the challenges that we've heard is that there is this threshold in terms of when the public ought to be notified. And, we've heard witnesses say that in a lot of cases it would be never, in a sense that, that's such a high threshold. We know that there's a panel. It's made up of 5 senior public servants. So my question, I guess, in 30 seconds, is this the right structure, or should we look at something else, or what ought to be done in terms of when and how the public is notified on such an issue in 30 seconds?
this is hard because it's you as soon as you alert the public that there's an issue, then there are going to be questions about whether or not the results of the election will be accepted no matter what, because you've already flagged there's a problem, and then what do you do about it? And so if you go, it doesn't matter who it is. Well, maybe it matters a little, but I mean, as soon as you say it, the election, I think, the result is not going to be accepted as it would have been.
Thank you. Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup. 5 minutes. Merci. Madame la Présidente, ma question s'adresse... tout d'abord, j'aimerais remercier nos deux témoins ici, mais j'aimerais poser ma question à Madame Marino. Madame Marino, vous avez parlé de la Russie et aussi les témoins qu'on avait dans le panel juste avant vous, antérieurement, a aussi soulevé la question de la Russie, puis les effets...
On pose juste un instant.
I understand that there's no interpretation. Can you hear me? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Yes, interpretation is working. Good. Could you please start your question again, Mr. Fergus? Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, for your indulgence. And this it gives me an opportunity to restart my own personal stopwatch. So first, I'd like to thank both witnesses this evening for their testimony. My questions will be directed at Ms. Marino. Ms. Marino, in a previous panel, witnesses raised the issue of Russia and the ramifications of the interference on the part of Russia in an attempt to undermine democracy in the United States in 2016, in the United Kingdom, and also here in Canada, I might add. Now, you've studied the issue of Russian interference. Could you please elaborate on what their modus operandi is, please, when it comes to interfering in Western elections? Well, thank you very much for your question. The technique that Russia used in 2016 and 2020 was a constant, rapid, massive flow of information, far more quick than any social media platform or human being could easily produce and disseminate. So as I responded to a previous question, a whole slew of information will be sent out. Some of it is contradictory. The truth is of little consequence. What is retained in terms of information and what is then shared is whatever acts as a hook. What will be retweeted? What will be reshared on Facebook and most quickly? And if there is a trend that seems to be appearing, if there is some sort of a hook, well, then that will be maintained. If there is information that is not serving as a hook, that information will be discarded. So the strategy is speed and quantity. That's their strategy. And what are the ramifications? Yes, we're still seeing them. As soon as division is sowed, as soon as doubt is sowed, it's difficult to rectify and rebuild from that place. In the United States, there's a major segment of the population that no longer trusts its public institutions. Russia, political parties have repeated that the election was stolen, that it was once a certain segment of the population is hooked, once they've lost trust in those institutions, it's difficult to win back their trust and to create a form of unity in a country. So yes, that divisiveness remains. When a political party, for example, as we saw in the United States, and in Canada things might play out differently, but as we saw in the United States, the political party that politicizes information and uses it as talking points, uses it divisively. And that's very difficult to go back from that, to get back from that place. Thank you very much for your answer. Is there any parallel to be drawn in Canada, for example? Well, I don't think that I can effectively respond to that question. I've mostly studied Russia and the US. Are there any other state players that have played a similar role to Russia and the United States? What about China? What about Iran? We've heard testimony in other previous panels to that effect, where witnesses raised those three countries. It's almost like the troika, the tripartite three countries that engage in political interference. Response. In my research, yes, China, Iran. China and Russia didn't necessarily share the same information or share the same objectives, but in the case of Russia, clearly the Republican Party was being favoured, whereas China favoured the Democratic Party. Which player would be more sympathetic to which of our political parties? I'm not sure. The Russians determined, the Chinese determined that the democratic establishment didn't serve their purposes, whereas the Chinese saw that they would. But in all three cases, disinformation is propagated. It's financed and sponsored, state-sponsored, and it's a full-time job that they're engaged in. These are permanent organizations, the sole task of which is to propagate disinformation with a number of objectives in mind. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Thank you to the witnesses.
Madame Normandin, 2 minutes.
Ms. Normandin, 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. I'd like to come back to you, Professor Turnbull. In your opening remarks, you said foreign interference is nothing new, but it's taken on new forms over time. So one can imagine that with a 4-year term in office, things evolve very quickly between elections. How important is it to have a body that would be tasked with combating election interference outside the election periods themselves? Another witness alluded to the creation of independent arm's-length body, not the RCMP, not CSIS, that would report directly to the House of Commons, that would be independent, somewhat akin to the Auditor General. Your thoughts on that kind of tool, please?
Thank you for that. I can see the logic to it because as elected members, you're in a bit of a tough spot to make to deal with this without the help of an independent body, because there's a sense that, you know, because you are the participants in the very elections that you're talking about, it's possible that people want a totally nonpartisan treatment of a thing like this, and so you can imagine such a thing that has expertise from security, people who have expertise in security issues, people who have expertise in cybersecurity, in democratic health, and all kinds of things that would come together to build a kind of organization that was able to take a very kind of cross-disciplinary approach to figuring out how to deal with these sorts of things, and reporting to Parliament would be important because you would want everything to be open and transparent. That said, I'm always a little nervous when we take decisions away from Parliament. And not that you'd be taking decisions away from Parliament, but sometimes there's a kind of, there can become a whole bunch of voices, and there's a sense from the public that, oh, we're going to appoint one more person who can't really make decisions, but they can talk about things, and they can give advice, and they can do reports. And I honestly, I have a sense of urgency about this that I wouldn't be entirely satisfied if that sort of thing happened, but I could see why it would have value.
Madame Blaney, 2 minutes et demi.
2.5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair. So, Professor Turnbull, I'm going to come back to you so that we can follow up on this discussion of lowering the voting age to 16. It reminds me of knocking on a door and having a 17-year-old drag his mother, who did not want to talk to me at all, down. And he asked all the questions, and she just listened in. So I think they can be very engaged. So if you could just finish that. And the second question I have is I feel like what you were recommending is an inquiry on democracy, not just focusing on foreign interference in elections, but on the state of democracy. So I was just wondering, what kind of things do you think should be studied or publicly inquired through that process?
Okay, so on the first point, I think that, again, if we considered lowering the voting age, at the same time that there is a vigorous kind of civics education process. You're getting people when they are still in school, and when they are they've got the day to learn. And my daughter is 9, and she told me about how much she wishes she was doing more civics in school. And I was, of course, so excited to hear that. But I think that there's a lot of value and that there's an opportunity there. And I understand that education's provincial jurisdiction is going to be all kinds of issues, but I honestly think that we can pull that off. And I think the other thing is that from a teenager's perspective, you have a different view on, in terms of forward looking. You have a different idea about the long term and trying to make decisions that will make sure that the planet is a good place for you. You're thinking long term about things. You actually do take, I think in many ways, a very different kind of vantage point to the sorts of questions that we're asking ourselves. And so it doesn't mean that people who are younger have different priorities when it comes to climate change, cost of living. I think we see a lot of overlap between, across ages, depending on who we ask. But I think it would be a different perspective sometimes because there's this sense that you are in this for the long haul. And it's very much a perspective that's worth and very important to gather.
Okay, and I don't have enough time for you to answer the public inquiry on democracy. So if you want to send something written, I'm sure the chair will tell you all about how to do it.
Thank you.
Well, that was another very fruitful panel. And as I like to remind all of our guests, if there is anything that you would like to elaborate on or add or something else comes to mind, please just share it with the clerk, and the clerk will make sure that it is circulated around in both official languages. Madame Marino, Ms. Turnbull, I want to thank you both for the time you've taken with us and the insights that you've provided. It really does mean a lot to us for the purpose of the study and beyond. And on behalf of all PROC committee members, I would like to thank you both for your time and attention and for being with us here today and for all the important work you do. So please keep well and safe. And with that, have a good night. Meeting adjourned. We will see you on Thursday, 10 a.m. for subcommittee, 11 a.m. for everyone else in 225 West Block. Take care.